How old were medieval soldiers? Hi folks, Matt Easton here. So, as you know, I do a lot of medieval topics on this channel and I dabble in the worlds of obviously HEMA, but also medieval reenactment. Now recently I did the fantastic Battle of Tewkesbury reenactment, which is something that me and my group do every year, and I have lots of friends who are heavily involved in reenactment as well. And one of the questions that comes up to us from members of the public, but also here on my channel when I did a recent video, was how old were medieval soldiers? And the reason is there's a perception that a lot of reenactors aren't very representative of the actual people who fought in these medieval wars. And the typical accusation is that medieval reenactors are too old to be playing medieval soldiers. But is that actually true? Well, complete honesty here, I actually thought it was a bit true. However, I decided to go away and research it. Now, it's very difficult to research the ages of all soldiers at all times, in all countries, all places, and all wars and campaigns, because that's an awful lot of data to trawl through. So I thought, well, let's look at the particular battle that I was actually reenacting in, under which this accusation came in. Let's look at the Battle of Tewkesbury. And actually we have quite good data, certainly for the nobility, and I'll come back to this point in a second, but for the nobility we've got quite good data of who was at the Battle of Tewkesbury. And, not always, but for the most part, we know when they were born. That means we know how old they were at the Battle of Tewkesbury, which was in 1471, incidentally. Now, I'll come on to some details and caveats in a minute. This book is therefore extremely useful. This is from the Tewkesbury Battlefield Society. You can buy it online if you search for it, and it's called The Street Banners of Tewkesbury. And you might think, what's banners got to do? Well, quite simply, they go through all of the people who were known to be at Tewkesbury with their coat of arms. Some of them aren't exactly correct, unfortunately, but some of them are near enough to correct. But they've got lots of data about the people, and particularly, you will notice up here, birth and death dates. So therefore we can subtract the birth date from 1471 to find out how old they were at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Now, before I go on, the caveats we have to say, this is just one battle in one war, the Wars of the Roses, in one country, England, and obviously it was different at different times in different places, so this is just one data point. But it's an incredibly good data point because we know an awful lot of people, certainly nobility, I'll come back to that point in a second, who were at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Now, nobility, why do I keep mentioning this? We have very good records for the nobility. We don't have very good records, unfortunately, for common people, all of the archers and the billmen and the gunners and the supply chain people. We don't have records for those, and it's true if you're doing family history research. For example, if you have an ancestor, for example, I know two of my ancestors were actually at the Battle of Tewkesbury, but I'm sure there were lots more who were common people who happened to be, you know, archers or billmen or whatever, who were involved in the Wars of the Roses. I only know about those two because they happen to have been aristocracy and therefore the records survive. But all of my other ancestors, the vast majority who weren't aristocracy, it's not recorded. People just didn't record for them, and certainly for the most part didn't record their birth and death dates, unfortunately. So this is a small glimpse, but it does give us some clues. Now, briefly before I delve into this, I just want to mention also that we do have some data for other wars, for other battles. For example, we've got archaeological data from something like the Battle of Visby, and which was pretty much just over 100 years before this, 1361 I think. So we've got data from the skeletons of that, and obviously the exact ages aren't always known from skeletons, but you can estimate them. And interestingly, a lot of the people who were killed at Visby were townspeople, they weren't soldiers. I'll come back to that point in a second. But in a nutshell, they varied from children through to the elderly, from fully healthy, fully able people to people with disabilities. So obviously they were townspeople, they weren't picked as soldiers, so they were just fighting in defence of their area, of their region, of their town. And so it involved men and women, able-bodied, people with disabilities, young and old. Okay, so a complete cross-section, and that is true of a lot of medieval and ancient world warfare when civilians get dragged into war. And this is a really important point to mention. In the time of the Wars of the Roses, and this would also go for the 100 Years' War and lots of other medieval wars, you've got different types of soldiers. you have the aristocracy, the knights, if you want to call them that, even though they weren't all knighted, esquires and knights, who it's basically their job to own and manage an estate and look after the people living on their estate and to fight, to give military service. They're the military class, okay? They're like Klingons, right? Then you've got people who are their direct household and retainers. That is, people who've been specially selected and recruited as soldiers. They are career soldiers. They're probably the closest thing in the medieval world that we've really got to the modern standing army, the professional soldiers. So they are fighting men, healthy, for the most part well nourished, for the most part probably fit and strong and stuff like this, and adept with their weapons. However, they're not the majority of troops. The majority of troops in most medieval warfare are levies, okay? And in England at the time of the Wars of the Roses, for example, at something like the Battle of Towton, the majority of soldiers would have been levied militias, essentially. So they would have been called up to serve for the lord of their area or for their particular town. And we see things like the Bridport muster roll and the various other muster rolls. So a town, Bridport in Dorset in this case, has a record surviving. Most of the records don't survive, but for that one it does. That lists the people who were called up to give service mostly as either billmen or archers, and they had worse equipment. They were not permanent soldiers. They had other trades. They were butchers or carpenters or farmers or whatever. And so they varied in age and they varied in competence and ability as well. So this book is organised alphabetically. I am not going to go through every person on here because this would be the world's longest video. I'm just going to go through pretty much random ones, and some of these individuals have interesting little stories. I might pull out a few anecdotes if I think they'll be interesting to you. So the very first person in the book is Sir William Allington, and he was born in 1429. That means in 1471 he was the grand age of 42. Not really old, certainly not young. By medieval standards, he was definitely middle-aged. He is also notable because he fought at the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury, and in fact was the King Edward IV's standard bearer at Tewkesbury, fighting by his side and acting as part of his bodyguard. And in fact, after the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1472 to about 75, I think, he was one of the tutors to his eldest son, the Prince of Wales. The very next example in this book is someone who fought for the Lancastrian side, Sir John Arundel. He was born in 1421, which means in 1471 he was the grand old age of 50. Certainly no spring chicken. Even older than me. But by medieval standards, actually, you know, that's a good old age, especially for someone who's fighting in the front lines in a battle like Tewkesbury. His side, the Lancastrians, lost, and in fact he was captured at some point during the battle, but he was granted a general pardon already by July the 19th, 1471, after paying a fine of £6,000. So he was obviously considered a good egg. Now next up is Sir John Barr, and he had an incredibly long career, first off as a Lancastrian. In fact, he did various things before the Wars of the Roses, but he was born in the amazing year of 1412. That means he was 3 years old when the Battle of Agincourt happened, which means that by the time he was fighting, well, he fought through the Wars of the Roses on the Lancastrian side, but then he actually switched to the Yorkist side. He fought at Barnet and Tewkesbury, which means at Tewkesbury in 1471 he was 59 years old. That's right, nearly 60. So contrary to people's popular belief, and I'm not just picking out the oldies here, we will get to some younger ones in a minute, but contrary to popular belief, some people fighting at the Battle of Tewkesbury, 59 years old, in the year 1471. I personally think that's quite incredible. And these people at this time, these weren't like generals commanding from the back. They were in the front frickin' lines in their full plate harness, fighting with everybody else. And just as a minor point of interest as well, because people often ask me how old did people live in the medieval period, he died in 1483, so in Richard III's time, which is amazing, because so he therefore lived to 71. Now, this might sound incredibly old by medieval standards. Actually, it wasn't that incredible. There were a lot of people in the medieval period, particularly in the well-fed classes, shall we say, who did actually live to what would be considered to be an acceptable age, even in the modern world. So there you go. He fought right the way through the Wars of the Roses, was 59 at the Battle of Tewkesbury, lived to be 71. So next up is a less old person, Sir Richard Beauchamp of Boddington. He was born in 1434, which means in 1471 at Tewkesbury, he was 37 years old. I think at the time this was regarded as basically middle-aged. You weren't old, you certainly weren't young anymore. And it is interesting that he performed so actively at the Battle of Tewkesbury that he was actually knighted after the battle by Edward IV himself for his actions in preventing the Lancastrians from entering Gloucester and his general loyal services to the Yorkist cause. This is actually a repeated theme because Edward IV after Tewkesbury knighted a whole bunch of people, in fact. But nevertheless, he was very active, he was there, he was in armour, and he was very active in the rest of the Wars of the Roses as well, and he was 37 at the time of the battle. Now here we have a rather notable exception of the Beaufort family, very important family during the Wars of the Roses, Sir John Beaufort, and he actually died at the Battle of Tewkesbury. He was fighting alongside his brother, and he was killed at the battle on the Lancastrian side. He was born in 1441, therefore he died in 1471 at the battle, so he was 30 years old when he died. So again, neither old, neither young. Similarly, his brother Sir Edmund Beaufort, who died at the battle, or was rather executed, he was born in 1439, which means that he was 32 years old. Again, kind of middle-aged by, probably even actually slightly younger than middle-aged by medieval standards. So again, he was no kid, he wasn't a teenager, he wasn't even in his 20s anymore. That's Sir Edmund Beaufort, who was the Duke of Somerset, no less. Now, Sir Thomas Berkeley, who was at various times Sheriff of Rutland, Sheriff of Leicestershire, Sheriff of Warwickshire, Cambridgeshire, Huntingdonshire, and for Berkshire in various years. So he held a lot of public offices. But he was born in the amazing 1413, which means in 1471 he was 58. Certainly no spring chicken, and he fought at both the battles of Barnet in 1471 and the Battle of Tewkesbury in the same year. So there we go, another example of a man well into his advanced age by the standards of the day, 58 years old, fighting at both those battles. Now this next one is not a particularly important historical character, but is of personal interest to me. It's Sir Humphrey Blunt. Now spelt Blount, incidentally. The reason why Sir Humphrey Blunt is of particular interest to me is that I am having a new armour made based on his effigy. His effigy survives, and he was at the Battle of Tewkesbury. I think he was at Barnet as well. Yes, he was at the Battle of Barnet in 1471. Now, he was born in 1422, which interestingly means that at the time of the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury, he was 49 years old, which is actually 2 years older than I am now, which means that, you know, whether you care or not, it probably doesn't really matter. But if I am wearing the armour of Sir Humphrey Blunt at Tewkesbury, ironically, I'm not older than the person I'm portraying, even though I'm not portraying him. If I was, I'm actually slightly younger than the person. We actually find this is the case sometimes with the reenactors who engage in Wars of the Roses reenactment. Yes, most of them are a bit older than the people they're representing, but sometimes they're actually younger than the people they're representing. So here's an interesting person you might not have heard of, and I'm going to tell you a bit about his career. His name is Sir John Brooke. There's his coat of arms there. And he was born in 1447, which means at the time of the Battle of Tewkesbury, at which he was present, he was 24 years old. Now, I should point out, although I've pulled out some random examples from here, you might notice a lot of them so far have been quite old, but there are some young people in here as well, and some people who, by medieval standards, would have been considered youngish, going towards middle age, so let's say late 20s, early 30s, this kind of age. But this guy's 24, so he's still fairly early on in his career, but he had a very interesting career after Tewkesbury. So after the battle, King Edward IV knighted him for his loyal services. He was created 7th Lord Cobham of Waycroft in Devon in 1473. In 1475, he served in the invasion of France with a contingent of 5 men-at-arms, besides himself, and a body of 50 archers. That gives you a good idea of how many archers there were compared to men-at-arms. He attended the coronation of Richard III and supported him during the Duke of Buckingham's rebellion and the Kentish uprising of 1483. In May 1484, Richard III made him a joint commissioner of array for Kent to prepare Dover and Sandwich against attack from Sir Edward Woodville. He supported then Henry Tudor when he took to the throne in 1485, once Richard III had been killed, and in 1491 to 92 he was sent to Flanders in support of the Emperor Maximilian. When Cornish rebels advanced into Kent in 1497, he helped Sir George Neville, 3rd Lord Abergavenny, to keep the county loyal even after his own cousin Lord Audley, the leader of the rebels, had been executed. What a blooming interesting career. And he lived to the fairly healthy age of 65. So there we go. He was aged 24 at the Battle of Tewkesbury, but then had a long and very interesting military and political career right the way through to the year 1512. Another fairly typical personage, Sir George Brown of Surrey, so near to me basically. I live in Surrey. And he was born in 1440, therefore 1471 he was around the age of 31, which is a really common, this kind of mid-20s through to mid-30s, a really common age for knights, essentially, who were at Tewkesbury, even though we find younger ones and older ones. A minor point of interest about Sir George Brown, though, was that he actually joined the Duke of Buckingham's rebellion against Richard III in 1483, and he was actually captured and executed on Tower Hill, next to the Tower of London, on the 4th of December 1483. So we've got a big old spread of ages at the Battle of Tewkesbury. A lot of people were born in the 1430s and 1440s who served in 1471 at Tewkesbury. Here 1440, 1422, 1424, 1437, unknown, 1445, 1445, 1445, a lot of them in the 1440s, 1415. Who's this? Sir Gervase Clifton of Brabourne in Kent. So he was born in the year of the Battle of Agincourt and died at the Battle of Tewkesbury. That means he was 56 years old at Tewkesbury and presumably would have lived for a good number of years after that if he hadn't been beheaded. So he was one of the Lancastrians that fled and sought sanctuary at the Tewkesbury Abbey. And so this was a typical medieval thing that if you could get into a church, into holy ground, a bit like in Highlander, then you could claim sanctuary, and hopefully, you might have to stay there for the rest of your life, but you could claim sanctuary and be safe from being killed, essentially, or taken prisoner. However, the Yorkists actually went into the abbey. They took out the people who'd sought sanctuary in there. They were given a sort of a bit of a sham of a trial, essentially found guilty of treason, and he was one of those who was beheaded in the market square of Tewkesbury, which is one of the things that's actually reenacted to this day at the Tewkesbury Medieval Festival. So there you go. He died at the age of 56, but he was fighting in the front lines with the Lancastrians in his mid-50s. And again, a lot of the people in here born in the 1440s, 1448, 1444, 1445. Someone here born very early, I won't go into this one, but 1414, so there's another older gentleman who died again at Tewkesbury. 1435, 1435. So this sort of margin between, let's say, 25 and 35, a very common age to be in a battle at that time. In fact, just to caveat that with saying that as I go through here further into the book, 1432, 1432, 1430, 1432. So there were a lot of people around the late 30s and around the age of 40 at the Battle of Tewkesbury as well, according to this. So I finally come across someone who is actually younger, and it's not that easy to find particularly young people in here. I'll talk more about young people towards the end of this, because I think there's an assumption amongst modern people that in the medieval period a lot of teenagers and people around the age of 20 were fighting, and it doesn't seem to actually be the case. But here is someone who was around 20 to 21 years old, and he was Sir Thomas FitzAlan, Lord Maltravers, and he was later, that tells you that he survived, the 17th Earl of Arundel in Sussex, aka Arundel Castle, where you can still see FitzAlan effigies today. It's an absolutely fantastic place and you should visit it. I do on a regular basis. And he was born in 1450. So he was 21 years old, and he is one of the youngest people I've so far found in this book who was actually a knight, should we say, or a nobleman fighting at Tewkesbury. So that kind of goes against this common perception, I think, that lots of teenagers were fighting. So here's a 20-year-old. He had a very interesting career, served right the way through the Wars of the Roses, and in fact he lived until 1524. So he lived to the age of 74. Good old age, especially when you consider that he lived through several military campaigns and led a pretty tough life, actually. And I don't want you to think that I'm cherry-picking the old people out here to favour old people like me. Not at all. I'm literally just going through the book. So Thomas FitzAlan was one of the youngest ones that I've found so far. Sir Thomas FitzHenry, for example, of Monington in Hertfordshire, he was born in 1415, so he was 56 at the Battle of Tewkesbury and died there. If I flip over the page, I come to Sir John Fogg of Ashford in Kent. He was born in 1414, so he was about 57 at the Battle of Tewkesbury, and he lived till 1490. Here we've got someone, that's Sir John Fogg still. Here we've got someone born in 1412. So there's someone who's, 59, if my maths is correct? Sir John Fortescue of Ebrington in Gloucestershire. I mean, and he lived till 1476. So these aren't short-lived people by the standards of the day. And these were people who were still fighting, still engaged in war. I mean, God, he only lived, he was born in 1412, was 59 at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, and was still alive in 1475, 1476. So this is exciting. I found another young person. That's Sir Thomas Grey. There's his coat of arms. 3rd Lord Grey. He was later 1st Marquis of Dorset. I love Dorset, by the way. He was at the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury on the Yorkist side. And he was born in 1451. So he was only about 20 years old, maybe even 19 years old, at the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury. That is one of the youngest people I've come across in this book so far. Not to say there aren't younger, there are a few, but that's pretty young. So certainly by the standards of the Wars of the Roses and the Battle of Tewkesbury, 20 years old is very much at the youngest end of the scale for nobles who were present and actually fighting and actually serving as knights. Now, given that, and given his relatively young age at the time, and especially as there were a lot of people there who were a lot older than him, interestingly, he fought he fought at Barnet and Tewkesbury, but at the Battle of Tewkesbury, he was the joint commander of the Yorkist right wing with Sir William Hastings. That's incredible, given that he was 19 or 20 years old. So I can only think that they were really grooming him, really, for command. The fact that he was directly under Sir William, or joint command with Sir William Hastings, meant that partly probably because of his family and the importance of his family, but also because they were expecting him to be one of the great commanders of the next generation, they put him with a more experienced person, and he was there to really learn the nuts and bolts of war. And we saw this happen with Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who was the younger brother of Edward IV, and he was young at the Battle of Tewkesbury, but of course he went on to become Richard III and a great military leader until he died. Sir Thomas Grey incidentally went on to serve in the French campaign of 1475, which wasn't very successful for the English, but it's an interesting bit of history anyway, and he supplied and came with 8 men-at-arms and 80 archers. Again, this is a ratio we often see at this time. It is a 1-to-10 ratio. So the number of men-at-arms you can supply and the number of archers you can supply is obviously relative to how much land and wealth you have and how powerful you are, your status. But even someone as high status as this only provided 8 men-at-arms or knights and 80 archers. But it's that kind of 1-to-10 ratio, and it really reiterates how important archers were to English armies at this time. Now, kudos to the oldies out there. This is enough to give us all hope, okay? So this is one of the oldest people who I have a record for being at Tewkesbury, Sir Edmund Hampden of Beckley in Oxfordshire. And he was born in 1398. That's right, 1398. That means at the Battle of Tewkesbury, he was 73. I mean, get your head around that. We're talking about the 15th century here. He was born in the 14th century, born in 1398, fought at Tewkesbury in 1471. The grand old age. Imagine a 73-year-old, full plate harness. Probably it must have arrived on horseback, fighting probably in the front lines. In fact, definitely in the front lines at the age of 73. I mean, hat tip to you. However, sadly for Sir Edmund, he picked the wrong side, just like lots of people in the Wars of the Roses. He was a Lancastrian, and basically he fought on the Lancastrian side at Tewkesbury and was killed. However, his body was taken to the Abbey, where it was buried under the north aisle of the church at the foot of the chancel arch next to St George's Chapel. So he had an honourable burial at Tewkesbury Abbey. So sadly, he died at the age, they actually say, of 72, so maybe his birthday hadn't come yet. But at the age of 72, amazing that he fought in the front lines and died at Tewkesbury at the age of 72. What a guy, and what an interesting life he must have led. And as you'd expect, lots more people between the age of about 25 and 40. We've got born in 1440, 1431, 1435, 1448, 1435, 1435. A lot of people born in 34, 35, 1435, 1430. So a lot of people in this kind of golden centre point of between the ages of 25 and 40, and a fair number older than that, and actually, surprisingly to me anyway, far fewer people younger than that. It's much harder to find people under the age of 25 than it is to find people over the age of 40 or even 50. And it's not even hard to find people older. We've got Sir John Langstrother, born in 1416. We've got Sir John Lucanor, born in 1419. It goes on and on. There's absolutely loads of them born really quite early on. 1410, there's one here. And I'm just pulling these out at random, as you can see. Sir Christopher Moresby, born in 1410. So he was 60, 61 at the Battle of Tewkesbury. These are not hard to find. It is actually much harder to find the younger ones. And funnily enough, one of the younger ones that I refer to, and well, I mean that by under the age of 25, is actually here, Richard Plantagenet, Duke of Gloucester, later Richard III. That's who I bodyguard for my mate Nick at the Battle of Tewkesbury reenactment. And he was born in 1452, which means that he was around 18, 19 years old at the Battle of Tewkesbury. And he is one of the youngest people in this book. It's very difficult. Statistically, the people below the age of 25 are far fewer than the people over the age of 50, which I don't know about you, but personally I found that really surprising. So we're going to finish up on one of the youngest people I could find, who is one of the main characters of the Battle of Tewkesbury, the Prince of Wales on the Lancastrian side, so the son of Margaret, Queen Margaret, and he died. Well, we're going to find out about that in a second, but he was born in 1453, which means that at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, he was around 17 or 18. I'm actually not sure which, 17 or 18 years old. So pretty young, okay? And while he was one of the sort of main figureheads, I won't quite say commander necessarily, but he was one of the main figureheads. Sadly, he died because, of course, he was one of the claimants to the throne, and that was what the whole war was about. But, you know, he was a mere 17 or 18, and this was unusual. This is unusual in all of these records of everybody who was there. He is particularly young. So if you think that there were lots and lots of teenagers, I think hopefully I've dispelled that idea by now. There were lots of people in their 20s, lots of people in their 30s, even 40s, even 50s, some in their 60s and 70s, as what we've seen. So he was the son of Henry VI, and therefore his mother was Queen Margaret. Sadly for him, at Tewkesbury, he was killed. He was killed probably while fleeing from the battlefield. That's not certainly known. Now, he did lead from the front. Apparently, according to some sources, he was very bellicose, he was very capable, he was very keen fighter and soldier, and a lot of people thought that he had the spirit of Henry V, his grandfather. But it is thought that he was killed probably while fleeing from the battlefield as the Lancastrian army collapsed, although some later writers say that he was taken alive and then was subsequently killed in cold blood by the Yorkist leadership. This could be political propaganda, we don't know. But he was therefore the last member of the House of Lancaster with a direct claim to the throne. Obviously later on the Tudors come along. So there we go. Right, in terms of ages, so I've been through quite a lot of people on here and I hope you've stuck with me, but I hope that's dispelled the idea that there weren't any older people fighting in medieval warfare. Certainly in the Wars of the Roses, and I say there might be different in other wars and different places at other times, but in the Wars of the Roses, there were a lot of people that we would commonly term middle-aged. So, you know, in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, some even in their 70s, and yes, there were a fair number in their 20s, but maybe not as many as you might think. And what I personally found surprising is it's really quite difficult to find examples of knights or nobles who were below the age of 25 and actually present at the battle. And as I say, it might be that if you look at other campaigns and other wars where maybe civilian populations are involved, and if we looked at the kind of levied troops, that's something like Tewkesbury, you might find a much younger average age indeed. There might be more people in their late teens and early 20s in that case. However, we do know some records from indentures from the 100 Years' War of archers and men-at-arms serving in the wars in France. And some men served for many years, and they can't have been young by the ends of their careers. So even if they were young at the start, they must have been well into their 30s or 40s by the end of their careers. So it does seem like soldiers' lifespans or kind of career spans was actually not that different in the medieval period to the modern world. And commanders could still be commanding troops well into their 60s and 70s, and even fighting in the front lines in armour in some cases. And lastly, I also want to dispel a slight myth about the medieval period, and that is the idea that everybody started their kind of adult life from a very early age. And it really wasn't the case. Certainly amongst the knightly classes and the aristocracy, you weren't really expected to start doing martial military things, usually until the age of 16. And indeed, they wouldn't even usually start training boys in the martial physical skills until about the age of 14. So you might start, you know, riding and the beginnings of jousting and swordsmanship and wrestling at 14. And then you might go to war, someone like Edward the Black Prince, famously winning his spurs at Crécy at about the age of 16. But that is really the earliest, and it is unusual. The fact that the Black Prince is recorded as winning his spurs at age 16 is an unusual thing. As we've seen here in the Wars of the Roses, it was unusual to see someone in their teens, very unusual, and actually relatively unusual to see someone even in their early 20s. Anyway, I hope this has been interesting. If you're not subscribed, please do so. It makes a big difference to me and the channel and who gets to see these videos. And maybe think about who you could share this video with who might get something out of it if they haven't seen it already. Thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will, of course, continue to be. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope you'll watch my next video. Take care, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.